On the morning when the roses along the church wall began to blow out and scatter their petals across the gravel like confetti from a wedding that had forgotten to be joyful, Miss Marple left her cottage to fetch a small packet of needles from Mrs. Hart's shop. It was, she thought, the sort of day that looked honest and was anything but. Sunshine had a way of cloaking small mischiefs. It made them look benign. She noticed the doctor's motor car purring past the green, and behind, her young Tommy Dagger on his bicycle, cap tilted at the insolent angle of boys who are certain the world was put in order for their convenience. The motor car turned down toward Hawthorne Cottage, which belonged to Mrs. Lydia Ransom, a widow with an unblemished reputation for tidiness, punctual letters to her sister in Cheltenham, and a sewing circle that had recently produced, though, with many sighs, a pieced quilt for the harvest jumble. Mrs. Hart had hands stained with cochineal from a crate of cherries and an opinion on everything. Needles, size 8? Well, dear, we've only the 6s, but those'll do, have you heard? Mrs. Ransom's been queer all week. Headaches and shut-up curtains. It isn't like her. She was in yesterday for good linen thread, white and that odd shade of bottle green. Bottle green, said Miss Marple, turning the word over. She had no especial love of green in garments except on girls with dark hair, but in thread it was peculiar. And did she seem anxious? She seemed, how shall I say, careful, as if she didn't want me to see what she'd written on a slip of paper. You know I never pry, Miss Marple, unless it's necessary. The village clock marked 11 with its tinny caution, and Miss Marple was about to remark that Mrs. Hart's abstinence from prying was one of St. Mary Mead's nobler fictions, when a sound, half shout, half sob, carried down the lane. It was Hetty Pike, Mrs. Ransom's daily woman, apron askew, hairpins fleeing in all directions. She won't answer, and the doors bolted within. People have ways of moving more quickly when tragedy wears a simple face. Miss Marple, who looked as if a brisk walk would undo her, arrived at Hawthorne Cottage in surprisingly good time, along with Mr. Ellison the postman and Mr. Sims from the smithy. The front door stood with the key in it. Hetty clutched at Miss Marple's sleeve. She's in the sitting room, I know it, I can hear the mantel clock, but she won't. They tried the handle. It did not yield. Mr. Sims put his shoulder to it while Hetty sobbed and begged him not to damage the paint. The door gave with a splintering snap. A smell of lavender sachets and lemon polish met them, bright and oddly proper. On the near table, her tea tray waited with its moral balance of 2 cups, 2 saucers, precisely equal slices of seed cake. By the hearth, in her upright chair, sat Mrs. Lydia Ransom, her chin tilted as if attending to a distant sermon, and the front of her cream blouse marked with a small red star. It was not much blood for a wound that had ended a life. The room had the unmoved air of a stage that has just been emptied of its players. Hetty made a sound, and then was silent. Mr. Ellison crossed himself. Miss Marple stepped forward with the quietness of a person who has learned that the first look is the truest. The little red star she saw was low, not high. The wound neat, not ragged. The blouse carefully laundered and ironed, as if this moment should not find it in any disarray of conscience. The window was latched, the rug smooth, the chair placed with mathematical respect to the hearth. On the side table sat a rosewood sewing box, whose lid, inlaid with faded mother-of-pearl, had become familiar to anyone who attended the sewing circle. Its ribbon compartments Miss Marple knew were usually in exemplary order. "Best fetch, Dr. Hale," Mr. Sims muttered, though the look in his eyes had already accepted what the doctor would say. "You mustn't touch," said Miss Marple without raising her voice. She bent to the rug. A single green thread lay near the leg of the chair, caught on the nap. She did not pick it up. Threads do not arrive in drawing rooms by themselves, but one is a timid witness and needs coaxing. To snatch at it is rude. The doctor came. The police followed. Inspector Lake, who had been new to St. Mary Mead last year and had by now acquired a patient respect for the village's elderly gentlewoman with the kind eyes, stood with his notebook and an air of trying not to be impatient. "Locked. From inside, you say?" he addressed the smith. "Window latched. No sign of disturbance. And the knife, where is the knife?" They looked for it because the wound said there had been one. There was no knife on the hearth or near the chair, none on the tray, none on the desk where Mrs. Ransom, kept her household accounts. The kitchen yielded its honourable set of knives, all present, all innocently butter-stained. Lake's men went into the passage and the bedroom and returned empty-handed, except for one oddity. Beside the bedroom looking-glass, a tiny smear of white, as though chalk had been used there, and then imperfectly wiped away. When people cannot make sense of a thing, they reach for the comfortable. Hetty began a litany of the ordinary. She took her tea at past, sir. 1 cup, sometimes 2 if she had company, which she was to have, though who I can't say for certain. Mrs. Ransom set out the tray herself. Wouldn't have me do it because she said the cups must match or it spoilt the look. The clock was striking 12 when I came with the linen she'd asked for, but the door was bolted and I knocked and knocked. She never bolted in the day, never. Whom was she expecting? Lake asked. Hetty looked at her hands. There was talk that Mr. Garrett might call, the agent from Stoneleigh who deals with her cottage repairs. Only that was last week. And the vicar's wife, perhaps, to discuss the harvest jumble. Mrs. Ransom has a sister, but she's away. There was also the nephew, Mr. James Ransom, come down from town sudden-like. I saw him yesterday in the lane. Smart hat, too smart for St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple could have supplied an addition by delicately clearing her throat, but she did not. She only looked, and looking gathered in small things. The tea tray, 2 cups, 2 saucers, a single spoon lying aslant as if someone had set it down to answer a question and not returned to finish the answer. Seed cake cut with exactitude, but the crumbs on the plate were few. Mrs. Ransom had not eaten, and yet a faint smear of something, sugar, marked the rim of 1 cup. On the hearth the ash was neat, not poked. The coal had been arranged with a tidy hand. Somewhere a bee droned against the window pane and then, discovering a cooler prospect, went away. The rosewood sewing box exerted a quiet gravity. It sat where Mrs. Ransom liked it, near to hand, because she did not care to have idleness befriend her. Lake's constable, with permission, lifted the lid. The compartments lay as demure as a maiden aunt's lace. Reels of white, grey and bottle-green thread, needles in their paper, a silver thimble, and, set diagonally beneath a fold of tape, a small dagger with a mother-of-pearl handle. The constable stopped breathing for a moment. They all did. It was the sort of object that looks ornamental until a neat, low wound insists otherwise. Lake took it up with a handkerchief. "Well," he said, trying not to sound relieved, "we've found it." "It seems," Miss Marple murmured, "that it wished to be found. The sewing box is an honest creature. It tells the truth about a woman when nothing else will. If Mrs. Ransom had put that little dagger there, it would be straight, quite straight, and the blood would not have dried in such a way along the rim of the handle. One can wipe a blade clean with surprising success, but handles, oh, handles do not forgive." Lake glanced at her and nodded. "We'll send it up to town. Fingerprints, though, I don't expect much. The room was locked, the window latched. Hetty, you're certain she never kept a duplicate key somewhere?" "She kept a spare for the back door under the 3rd brick," Hetty confessed miserably. "But the sitting-room keys always stayed in the lock. She said a room is safer if it keeps its own key where it lives." Miss Marple's eyes settled briefly on the little green thread near the chair leg. "And the bolt?" Lake showed her. "A simple brass affair above the lock, thrust home. No marks, no string, no tricks. The simplest sort of impossibility, my least favourite." "I never trust impossibilities," Miss Marple said softly. "They're made like costumes for a village play, stitched carefully enough for the audience, but always with a hem that can be turned up to show the basting. There were people to speak to. St. Mary Mead never lacked them. Mrs. Ellison reported that she had seen the nephew on the footpath to the common at 11:30 looking cross. Mr. Garrett, when found, produced an appointment card for last week, not today. The vicar's wife looked stricken and said she had indeed promised to stop by after midday to discuss the quilt raffle, poor dear, but had been delayed by a parishioner's cat with a fishbone. All their times wove a narrow window through which a murderer must have slipped like a thread through the smallest eye. Dr. Haley, returning to the body with his medical exactness, gave them what he could. Dagger thrust precise. One would say a single sure hand. 11:30 to noon for time of death, no sign of a struggle. She may have known her attacker. Lake's pencil went on with its patient scratching. "We've the weapon, hidden, which is a point against accident if any had thought of it. We've a locked room. We've 2 cups and the hint of a visitor who left nothing of himself, but a cup rim. We've a nephew who looked cross." "And a thread," said Miss Marple. "That does not belong to the rug. Bottle green is not a forgiving colour on cream. One sees it at once. And there is the matter of symmetry. Mrs. Ransom liked things in pairs. 2 cups, 2 slices, so naturally one expects 2 spoons. There is only one." Hetty began a small moan and stopped it with an effort. "I washed one yesterday, miss. It may be—" "No," Miss Marple said kindly. "No, you would not have left the tray unbalanced. You are like Mrs. Ransom in that. You would have fetched another or taken one away. Your hands speak tidiness even when your mind is full of fright." Lake looked at the tray anew, then at the bolt, then at the dagger in its handkerchief. The room arranged itself in his head into an order he could not like. If our visitor came, he drank his tea, killed her, hid the blade in the sewing box and left, bolting the door behind him from outside by miracle. "Not miracle," Miss Marple said, and her eyes, blue-grey and patient as weathered stone, rested again on the green thread. "No miracles are required in villages. Only a very little knowledge of how women mend thin places, and how a thread can draw what is loose until it seems fast." Lake followed her gaze. He frowned, and then his brows lifted. "String through." "The bolt, but there is no string." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "No string, only thread, bottle green, very strong if you double it. And white chalk, which can be persuaded to disappear if you do not clean the glass with too much zeal. I should like to know who asked Mrs. Ransom for bottle green yesterday, and why." Hetty whispered. "She said it were for the quilt, miss, only—" "The quilt uses blue and white, it does." "And who has fingers in St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple asked absent-mindedly. "Clever enough to knot so small a knot that it passes for nothing at all." She did not wait for an answer. It would come. Answers always came when you had put the room to rights in your mind and let it sit. She moved to the rosewood box and looked down at the little dagger again, its mother-of-pearl winking like an eye that did not blink. "And who," she added, "wishes very much that we should think the box swallowed a knife of its own accord." Outside, the sunshine lingered over the roses, as if determined to prove that beauty explains everything. Inside, the room kept its careful poise, waiting for someone to pull, with the gentlest of fingers, on a green thread, and see what unstitched itself. Inspector Lake had settled into his familiar routine, stationing a constable at the gate, calling for photographs, dispatching men to search the nephew's lodgings at the inn. He was a competent man, steady rather than brilliant, and his methods leaned on thoroughness rather than inspiration. To the casual observer, the case at Hawthorne Cottage was progressing exactly as it should. But Miss Marple, who sat unobtrusively, in a corner chair with her small-gloved hands folded, knew that thoroughness without imagination was like knitting without a pattern. One ended with a tangle, not a garment. Lake's questions were brisk. "The nephew, James Ransom. Background?" A young constable, eager to please, rattled off his notes. "Clerk at a shipping office in London, sir. Staying at the Swan. Arrived yesterday afternoon on the 3:30 train. Registered 1 night only. Neat handwriting, but no luggage beyond a single valise." "Neat handwriting?" Miss Marple repeated softly, as though it were the most curious part of the statement. Nobody marked it but the inspector, who frowned faintly. He had learned that when Miss Marple echoed something, it was usually because it mattered. James Ransom was duly fetched. He entered the sitting-room with an air of urban detachment, though his hat in his hand betrayed a slight tremor. He was a narrow-shouldered man in his late 20s, his suit fashionable enough for London, but a shade too jaunty for St. Mary Mead. His eyes slid to his aunt's body only once, quickly, as though to acknowledge it without granting it the dignity. "Of sorrow. I was on my way back to London," he said before the inspector had put a question. "I heard something had happened and came directly. Terrible shock, naturally. She was always a difficult woman, but family is family." He pressed his lips together in a way meant to suggest grief, but achieved only calculation. "Where were you this morning between 11 and noon?" Lake asked. "At the Swan, writing letters." He said it quickly as though prepared. Miss Marple's eyes moved to the edge of his cuff where a faint smear of white marked the dark fabric. Chalk? She thought so. But she did not interrupt. Instead, she bent to adjust her reticule, allowing her gaze to flick once toward the mantel. A small ivory paper knife, usually a fixture there, was absent. She recalled it precisely. A trifle Mrs. Ransom had once displayed with misplaced pride, claiming it had belonged to a cousin who served in India. Today, the mantel looked naked without it. Nobody else seemed to notice. The nephew's eyes lingered on the sewing box, then darted away too quickly. That too Miss Marple stored away. People who look away from an object are sometimes more revealing than those who stare. Hetty Pike, still tearful, had been sent to the kitchen. Miss Marple asked if she might follow, ostensibly for a glass of water. She found Hetty staring at the sink where a dishcloth lay soaked and crumpled. "Poor soul," Hetty murmured. "I can't think what she did to deserve it." Miss Marple's gaze rested on the cloth. Its wet folds held a faint reddish smear. She touched it delicately with the tip of her glove and then let it fall. "Dear." "Hetty," she said gently, "you didn't happen to wipe anything, did you? Something small, perhaps?" Hetty looked stricken. "It were the spoon, miss, the one left on the tray. I thought it might comfort me to make it tidy. I didn't mean—" Miss Marple patted her arm. "No harm, dear. Tidiness is a natural instinct, but sometimes tidiness hides things it oughtn't." She returned to the sitting room with the thought settled in her mind. 2 cups, 1 spoon wiped clean by a loyal servant, 1 cup bearing a sugar smear not touched by Mrs. Ransom. If 2 had drunk tea, one of them had been careful not to leave behind his spoon. Inspector Lake was questioning, James still pressing him about his movements. The young man bristled. "You can't possibly think I had anything to do with this. She was alive when I left her yesterday. I saw her only briefly." Miss Marple allowed herself a small cough. "Forgive me," she said, "but you mentioned you were writing letters this morning. You must have used the writing desk in your room at the Swan." "Yes, why?" "I only wondered," Miss Marple said mildly, "because Mrs. Ransom was very particular about her ink. She used black always, never blue. Yet here on her desk," she gestured to the bureau in the corner, "there is a pen, left uncapped, and the nib shows blue ink. A careless hand, don't you think?" Lake strode over and frowned at the pen. "You're right. Hetty, did your mistress ever use blue ink?" "Never, sir. She said it looked cheap." "The nephew's?" Mouth tightened, but he said nothing. Miss Marple noticed his thumb, rubbed raw as if from an impatient twisting of thread. The constables carried in a small packet found in James's valise. Lake unfolded it. A reel of bottle-green thread, new, with the Swan's shop label still. Affixed. James's protest was swift. "It's nothing, merely for mending a tear, perfectly ordinary." Miss Marple smiled gently as though forgiving him. "Indeed, very ordinary. Though bottle green is a shade not often chosen by gentlemen. For their mending, don't you think?" Lake was beginning to see it. "Thread strong enough to work a bolt, perhaps?" James flushed scarlet. "That's absurd. I know nothing of bolts or threads. You're twisting things." But his voice wavered, and Miss Marple's keen eye rested again on the smear of chalk at his cuff. She thought of the bedroom glass where chalk had been clumsily wiped. She thought of Mrs. Ransom's meticulous symmetry, 2 cups, 2 spoons, always pairs, and how death had disrupted it. She thought of the paper knife missing from the mantel, a second possible weapon, absent. But remembered, the authorities busied themselves with orders, with reports, with evidence bags. Miss Marple remained still, her mind working along quieter lines. A picture was forming, though faint, as though drawn on tissue paper. Someone had sat at tea, locked a door with thread and chalk, placed a dagger in a sewing box where it would not sit comfortably, and left behind a cup that told its own story. There was deception here, certainly, but whether it lay in the nephew's hurried protests, the servant's panicked tidiness, or some other hand altogether, well, that remained veiled. She would not speak too soon. Instead, she let her eyes travel once more across the room, to the small red star on the cream blouse, to the perfect symmetry of the tray marred only by the absence of a second spoon, and to the neat rug where a single green thread lay in silent witness. It was enough for now. The full picture would come, as all embroideries do, when enough threads had been drawn together. Inspector Lake chose the little morning room for interviews, a square of cool shadow and lavender polish away from the sight of the chair by the hearth. Miss Marple sat quietly near the door where she could see faces in profile. It is in profile, she had found, that lies most often travel. A mouth may pretend, but an ear gives itself away. Hetty Pike came first, knuckles red from scrubbing to steady herself. "I've told it all once, sir, but I'll tell it again," she said, breath-catching. "I set out the tray early, as Mrs. Ransom liked it waiting for the kettle. At 11 I went for the linen she wanted, 2 pillow slips and a runner. I came back before the clock struck 12 and found the door bolted. I knocked and knocked. "You laid the tray?" Lake asked. "Yes, sir, but the cups and slices she did herself. She was particular. Always 2 cups, 2 slices even. She said if God put us in pairs, we might as well honor it at tea. And sugar." Miss Marple's voice was mild. Hetty looked at her gratefully. A gentle question is easier to answer well. She never took. "See it, miss. Lemon if there was any, else plain." She kept lumps in the blue jar for visitors. That jar were on the tray. "And did she have visitors who sweetened generously?" Miss Marple asked, still looking at Hetty's hands rather than her eyes. "Hands worry truth into the open sooner than faces do." "Mr. Garrett takes 2 lumps, Hetty said after a moment. "He says it cures the sourness of parish gossip." "Mr. Garrett is not a parishioner," Lake observed. Hetty blushed. "He speaks as if he were, sir." Miss Marple let the point pass. "You told us you wiped the spoon because tidiness comforted you." Hetty nodded, tears threatening. "Just the 1 spoon left on the tray. It looked wrong." "The wrongness is useful," Miss Marple said gently. "It tells us someone meant to leave the tray right and failed." When Hetty had gone with a breath that was nearly a sob, the vicar's wife arrived in a flurry of apology and precise details. Mrs. Lydgate was a good woman who loved exactness until it turned cruel. "I would have come earlier," she said, "but the Thompsons' cat had a fishbone, the most dreadful choking. I was delayed at least 20 minutes. I passed the green at 25 past 12. I am sure of it, because I heard the clock strike the quarter as I crossed by the stocks. I had my pamphlet for the raffle with me. Poor Lydia Ransom always meant to help, but insisted we keep the quilt simple, no bottle greens in it, she said, because it would look too smart. Oh my. Dear, to think you were expected?" Lake asked. "She said after midday." "I never arrived before the time given," said Mrs. Lydgate with the pride of women who do not trespass on minutes. "I did see Dr. Hale's motor at the turn at, let me think, no, before the quarter. 11:50 perhaps. I am useless with exact times unless the clock tells me." Miss Marple's ear pricked. Mrs. Lydgate had a habit of sewing truth to what she wished true. The clock had struck the quarter when she crossed by the stocks, and yet she had also seen the doctor's motor before the quarter. That might both be so, but not with the order she desired. Miss Marple let it rest. "When exact women err, it is usually from the heart, not the will." Mr. Garrod followed, smooth as the envelope of a bill. He wore town shoes to a country lane and looked faintly offended by dust. "Tragic," he said, and touched his hat. "Mrs. Ransom was a client of my firm in the minor way of small investments. Stoneleigh is not far, Inspector. I was not expected. Today, my appointment was last week." He produced the card again, very ready, very correct. "You take 2 lumps of sugar, Mr. Garrod," Lake said flatly. "One must sweeten the truth to make it palatable," Garrod answered with a smile that had charmed many spinsters into signing dull papers. "Saw me, did she, the good Hetty? She notices everything and understands nothing." Miss Marple leaned forward as if to catch a word. "When you were here last week, did Mrs. Ransom speak of altering anything? Papers, bequests?" Her tone put no weight on bequests, and that was precisely why it carried. Garrod's eyes flickered. "A widow of modest means, Miss Marple." Miss Marple, of course. She inquired, many elderly ladies inquire, about the simplicity of a codicil. She wondered whether a small sum might be left to her daily woman in thanks. I said, "It was perfectly ordinary." "Ordinary," Miss Marple repeated, with the faintest emphasis that made the word look different to itself. "And her nephew?" Garrod's smile cooled. "Mr. James Ransom is her nearest relative, but nearest is not always dearest." The postman, Mr. Ellison, came in with his bag like a shield. He had a moral dislike of tragedies that interfered with his route. "No letters collected from Hawthorne Cottage this morning?" he said before anyone asked. Postmen like to be first. The pillar box at the Swan was cleared at 10:30. If Mr. Ransom wrote letters at 11, they're still with him or in the in-drawer unless he trusted them to the barmaid, which is not regulation. "Did you see Mr. Ransom about?" Lake asked. "On the green at 11:40, Ellison said promptly, standing under the lime as if counting leaves. "Men count debts that way, I've known it." The village shopkeeper, Mrs. Hart, arrived with righteous colour in her cheeks. "I never pry," she began, which in St. Mary Mead is the opening to a sonnet of prying, but bottle green is a bold shade. "Mrs. Ransom bought a reel yesterday, and I said to her, as one would, you know, that it was more for uniforms than quilts. She smiled her tight smile and said a small green can make the whites look whiter. She bought white also, and needles, size 8. And this morning the young gentleman from London, Mr. Ransom, came in for cigarettes and asked if I sold tailor's chalk. I told him I did not keep it. He looked vexed and bought a pencil." "Blue ink?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Hart shook her head with relish. "Never in my shop." Mrs. Ransom disapproved. "She told me once it makes a woman look cheap, even when only the envelope shows it to the postman." Miss Marple's glance moved to the ivory strip of mantle, where the paper knife should have been and was not. She let the lac sit in her lap like a cat. If Mrs. Ransom had meant to use it this morning, it had not returned to its place. If someone else had taken it, that someone preferred it to a dagger with a mother-of-pearl handle, or wished the dagger to be found instead. James Ransom came back because men in their 20s think repeating themselves makes lies true. He spoke readily, almost eagerly. "I wrote 2 letters at the Swan, one to my employer to say I was delayed and one to my friend in Holborn." He produced neither. "I had a cigarette on the green. I did not call at my aunt's because she disliked surprise visits." "The constable found a reel of thread in your valise," Lake said. "Where did you purchase it?" "At Wayne's haberdasher's in town," James said, biting the word like a small stone. "Yesterday, before I took the train, I mended a cuff. That is all." "The label reads S. Wayne," Miss Marple said softly. "S and W together can look like Swan if a person hurries. Constables do hurry." She smiled so politely that the young constable flushed and stared at his boots. "Tailor's chalk, Mr. Ransom?" "I borrowed some at the Swan to mark a seam. The chalk was blue." Miss Marple's eyes moved to his cuff where a pale smear clung like a confession that had not found its words. "Tailor's chalk is often white in ladies' boxes," she said, "not to James, but to the air. Blue in billiard rooms." "Do play billiards," James retorted. "The chalk is nothing at all." "Nothing at all is an expression that makes policemen suspicious," Lake said dryly. "You were seen on the green at 11:40. Your aunt died about then. Your thread is a convenient colour for a parlour trick. You carry blue ink on your person. I do not. And there is blue ink on her desk." Lake glanced at Miss Marple and found her hands folded as if in prayer. It steadied him, which annoyed him faintly. James set his jaw. "If you mean to arrest me, do it. I'll say nothing further." "You've said rather a lot already," Miss Marple murmured. After he had gone, there remained the doctor with his crisp facts and Mr. Sims from the smithy who had opinions about bolts. Mr. Sims demonstrated with a piece of twine how a thread might be passed under a door and looped through a drilled hole in the bolt. He became red-eared with pleasure at his own ingenuity. Miss Marple thanked him and considered. The bedroom glass, with its faint chalk smear, would have made a convenient pulley if someone had wished to draw a thread tight without being seen. But her mind nudged her like a careful friend. Men and twine make one kind of contraption, women and thread make another. 2 small contradictions sat and knitted their way into a pattern. Mrs. Lydgate's time wavered between the quarter and the doctor's motor. Eager women tend to push their arrivals later if tragedy makes earliness look unkind. And Mrs. Hart, who never pried, had noticed exactly the shade of thread and the question about chalk, yet had failed to mention until pressed that she had sold Mrs. Ransom white as well as green. White thread binds what you wish to seem pure. Green draws the eye. If one wished to use a thread to pull a bolt, bottle green was bold. White would vanish against a cream door and leave behind nothing anyone but a housewife would see. Miss Marple found herself suddenly remembering the quilt for the harvest jumble, blue and white by decree, with much sighing over whether any other colour would spoil the look. Mrs. Ransom had insisted on simplicity. "No bottle green in the quilt," Mrs. Lydgate had quoted, and yet yesterday Mrs. Ransom bought bottle green. A contradiction is not a confession, but it can be its first cousin. She asked Hetty back for one more question. "Did your mistress ever move the rosewood sewing box from the sitting room?" "Only to the bedroom when she mended in better light," Hetty said, surprised. "She liked it near. She said a sewing woman without her box is like a soldier without his kit." "And the paper knife?" "On the mantel always, miss. Mrs. Ransom said it made the room look furnished, which is not the same as lived in," she said. "That's a thing she would say." "Thank you, Hetty." Miss Marple rose. She did not need to lean on the chair, but she permitted herself the look of it because people are kinder to the old they think frail. In the hall she paused by the mirror, where the faint chalk smear had resisted a careless wipe. A length of curtain cord lay in a loop on the chest beneath it, its tassel frayed. Miss Marple ran a finger along the fray and found 3 short hairs, greyer than Hetty's and finer. She did not smile. Age had its vanities. Some women grew white at the temples and darkened the rest. White chalk on a mirror, a box that ought to have been straight but was not. A green thread that drew the eye, and perhaps had been meant to, at E. The door Mr. Ellison lingered. "There's this, miss," he said, embarrassed by his own helpfulness. "I slipped returning from the lane and crushed a leaf of Mrs. Ransom's geraniums, smelt strong as camphor, and I saw, under the hedge, a small white shaving, like from a knife. No, like from scraping a thing clean. I left it where it lay. A man shouldn't pick up what isn't his." "A very good rule," Miss Marple said. She went to the hedge and looked. A curl of dried whitish something lay there, brittle as a scrap of eggshell. It flaked a little under her glove. Mother of pearl, she thought. It bruises if handled roughly when wet. Someone had wiped a handle quickly and scraped at the seam where it met the blade. If a person had wished to put a dagger into a box, it did not belong to, and had only time to be neat in the gross way, and sloppy in the small. Well, they might. Leave behind a whisper under a hedge, and a proud dagger arranged a trifle wrong among reels. By late afternoon the room had been catalogued into evidence and silence. The village had by then produced all its voices, helpful and hesitant, exact and eager. Miss Marple sat again in her corner chair, seeing in her mind's eye the same room as it had been at 11:40, 2 cups, a single spoon left to comfort, a flustered woman into wiping it, a sugar smear on a cup not hers, a bolt drawn not by miracle but by knowledge any woman from a thrifty household might acquire, and a dagger that wished loudly to be the answer. Eagerness deceives as thoroughly as guile, she reflected. Mr. Garrard had been too smooth, Mrs. Lydgate too precise, James too ready with his letters that did not exist, and Mrs. Hart too proud of seeing what she had sold. Somewhere among them, a motive breathed softly, hardly daring to be named. It would not stay soft. Motives are like green threads on cream rugs. Once seen, they demand to be picked up. Inspector Lake had the look of a man hemmed in by too many paths at once. He sat at the little writing desk, his notebook full of statements, each as plausible as it was contradictory. Outside the window the afternoon sun was lowering, gilding the hedgerows with a deceptive peace, while inside Hawthorne Cottage the air seemed thick with unfinished words. Miss Marple sat with her knitting untouched in her lap, eyes lowered, but mind very much awake. She knew the inspector's difficulty well. Every suspect carried a motive sufficient for suspicion, yet none fit the crime neatly. Motives are like threads in a tangled skein. Pull one, and another knots itself tighter. James. Ransom, the nephew, presented the simplest picture, and therefore the most dangerous to accept too quickly. He stood to inherit his aunt's modest estate, perhaps a few £100 and the cottage itself. In London, clerks on thin salaries dream often of legacies, and it would not be unheard of for impatience to curdle into action. His eagerness to produce explanations, his hurried lies about letters, the incriminating reel of bottle green thread, All these pointed toward him with the bluntness of a signpost on the common. Yet Miss Marple's eye, trained by years of village life, distrusted signposts too near the road. If James had indeed contrived the bolt trick with thread and chalk, why then had he left such obvious traces? Why purchase thread in town and ask for chalk at the village shop if he meant to keep hidden? It felt like a man walking about with a lantern when he claimed to prefer the dark. Mr. Garrett, the agent from Stoneleigh, was another path in the maze. He had smiled too smoothly, spoken of codicils with too much readiness. A widow, lonely but careful, might easily be persuaded into small adjustments of her will, and Miss Marple knew from many a parish quarrel how the whisper of a legacy could turn neighbourly courtesies into quiet battles. Garrett's motive might be greed, or merely the fear of discovery, should his dealings prove less respectable than they appeared. Yet Garrett, too, did not quite fit. His alibi was vague, but he had not been seen near the cottage that morning, and his involvement seemed better suited to pen and ink than dagger and thread. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Lydgate, seemed at first glance the least likely, but Miss Marple's experience had taught her that women who cling fiercely to order are sometimes most disordered within. Mrs. Lydgate's contradiction over her timing, before the quarter or after, was a tiny crack, but tiny cracks let in more light than large ones. Had she wished to reach the cottage early, to prevent Lydia Ransom from altering her promises regarding the harvest jumble quilt or a bequest to Hetty Pike, she might have hastened her step and then adjusted the memory later. Her motive might not be greed so much as jealousy, the jealousy of a woman who guards the parish's projects as if they were her children. Yet could jealousy twist itself to murder? Miss Marple had once known a woman who poisoned her sisters, hens for less. Still, Mrs. Lydgate seemed too fluttered, too genuinely shocked, and Hetty Pike herself, the faithful daily woman, could not be dismissed. Hetty had as much to gain from her mistress's death as anyone. If Garrod spoke true, Mrs. Ransom had considered leaving her a legacy. Fear, too, might have moved Hetty. Fear of being dismissed if the nephew took control, fear of a small dishonesty being uncovered. Her wiping of the spoon was innocent enough on the surface, but tidiness can be both virtue and disguise. A servant who knows every bolt and cupboard might easily manage a trick of thread. And yet Miss Marple, watching Hetty's trembling hands, found it hard to imagine such precise cruelty in her. Panic, yes. Calculation, no. The doctor had no clear motive, but he had proximity and opportunity. His motor car had been seen near the green, his presence explained by a call to an ailing patient. Doctors, Miss Marple reflected, are both trusted and feared. They are given access to private ailments and private sins. Mrs. Ransom had headaches, Hetty said. A headache can be truth, or it can be a cover for something darker. Still, the wound had been made by a sure hand with a blade, not by subtle medicine. If the doctor's involvement existed, it was buried in shadows. And then there was Mrs. Hart, the shopkeeper, who had noticed far too much while claiming not to pry. She had supplied the very reel of thread that now seemed to matter so much. Motive might lurk in envy, for shopkeepers in villages often resent the customers they serve, tallying slights over the years like sums in a ledger. Or perhaps Mrs. Hart's motive was simpler, the satisfaction of inserting herself into the heart of the affair, ensuring that every whisper would pass through her shop door. Yet vanity, though sharp, rarely sheds blood. Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to wander back to the sewing box and its misplaced dagger. That was the oddest piece of the puzzle. A murderer who wished to hide the weapon would hardly place it where it must be found, yet one who wished to mislead. That was another matter. It was too convenient, too pat. She thought again of the missing ivory paper knife. Could it be that the dagger was but a showpiece, a planted clue, while the true weapon had been something else? And if so, who had benefited from such deception? The motives jostled like villagers at a fete. James with his inheritance, Garrod with his codicils, Mrs. Lydgate with her parish pride, Hetty with her insecurity, the doctor with his hidden knowledge, Mrs. Hart with her vanity. Each had reason enough to wish Mrs. Ransom silent. Yet the pattern was still blurred. Inspector Lake muttered over his notes. Every one of them has a motive, Miss Marple. It's as if she spent her last week gathering enemies the way some gather stamps. Not enemies, Miss Marple said softly, but debts. People owed her money, gratitude, patience, obedience. She was a tidy woman. She liked her accounts. Settled. Lake rubbed his forehead. And which of them wanted those accounts cancelled altogether? Perhaps, Miss Marple said, the one who feared most what she might put in writing. A codicil, for instance, or a letter, or even a note left carelessly on a desk in blue ink. She let that thought rest like a seed in soil. Lake's eyes narrowed, but he knew better than to demand more. Miss Marple spoke when her mind had fully embroidered its pattern, and not before. For now, the maze remained. Motives twisted upon themselves, greed dressed as duty, jealousy cloaked in exactness, fear hidden in tidiness, vanity disguised as help. But among them ran one thread, thin and nearly invisible, leading from the locked bolt to the chalk-smudged glass, from the sugar-smeared cup to the missing paper knife. Miss Marple's fingers itched as though to draw it gently free. She knew that once the right thread was pulled, the whole pattern of deception would unravel at her feet. By the following morning, Inspector Lake had the look of a man who wished the world were as straightforward as his reports. He sat in the snug at the Swan, a pot of weak tea cooling beside him, dictating the triumph that would shortly appear in his superintendent's file. The constables had returned from London with tidy facts about James Ransom, overdue debts, dismissed from his post in the shipping office for carelessness with figures, arrears on his lodgings. Added to the inheritance, added to the reel of thread and the chalk on his cuff, it made a pattern too neat for Lake to resist. James himself had broken after a long night in the village cell. His denials, repeated with bravado the previous afternoon, had softened into desperation. Faced with the evidence, he snapped like cheap twine. "Yes, I went to see her," he had shouted. "Yes, I asked for money. She refused. I left her alive." But the words lacked weight. They rang like a church bell with a crack in it. By breakfast, Lake had his confession. Fragmentary, self-contradictory, but enough for the machinery of justice to grind forward. St. Mary Mead hummed with approval. It was a comfortable solution. The wayward nephew, greedy and impatient, silencing the careful aunt. Villagers like their tragedies to be simple, preferably involving outsiders. "Blood tells," Mrs. Hart announced over her counter, satisfied. To be proven right about young men from London who looked too fine for their own pockets. Mrs. Lydgate shook her head in pity, but found comfort in having been nowhere near the cottage at the hour of death. Even Hetty Pike, pale and hollow-eyed, clung to the story, as one clings to a shawl in a draught. Only Miss Marple did not join the chorus. She had watched the interrogation from her corner chair, head slightly bent as though dozing. To most eyes, the confession seemed conclusive, but she had noticed how James's words shifted like wet sand. He admitted quarrelling but not striking. He admitted visiting but not entering. He admitted fear but not blood. And more telling still, he had looked almost relieved when the dagger from the sewing box was laid before him, as though a weapon so theatrical excused him from the charge of subtlety. A young man like James might be foolish, greedy, even desperate, but subtle he was not. That evening, Miss Marple walked past Hawthorne Cottage. The constables had sealed it, the blinds drawn, the roses still scattered petals across the gravel, heedless of human schemes. She paused at the gate, remembering the tea tray with its 2 slices of seed cake and its single spoon wiped clean. She thought of the missing ivory paper knife, of the chalk smear on the mirror, of the too-ready placement of the dagger in the sewing box. A true murderer does not lay clues like posies on a grave. No, those were arranged for the police to find. And who in St. Mary Mead knew precisely what the police looked for and how to present it? The following morning, Inspector Lake sought her opinion, more from courtesy than need. "It's finished, Miss Marple. The lad's guilty. His motive is money. His method the thread trick. His alibi worthless. We'll have him up before the assizes before the month is out." Miss Marple's eyes, mild as ever, rested on the steam rising from his cup. "It is convenient, certainly, and you may be quite right, yet I cannot help but think of the sugar jar." The sugar jar? Lake blinked. Yes, it was on the tray. Mrs. Ransom never touched sugar, and yet there was a smear on the rim of one cup. If James quarrelled with her and struck quickly, why take sugar? A man in temper does not pause to sweeten his tea. Lake frowned. Perhaps he sat with her first, pretended civility. Perhaps. Miss Marple's tone was soft. But civility does not usually extend to bolting a door behind oneself in so elaborate a manner. A young man in desperation, yes, he might seize a knife. But thread and chalk and careful staging, that is another sort of mind entirely. Lake shifted, uncomfortable. We have his confession. Yes, but it is not confessions that convict, Inspector, but truth. And truth is sometimes quieter than we like. You have noticed, of course, that Mrs. Ransom's sewing box contained both bottle green and white thread? He looked at her sharply. White? Yes, white thread, strong and neat, which would vanish against a cream door. Bottle green is bold, it catches the eye as you caught it. Yet there was a reel of white as well. Which would a clever hand choose if the aim were not to be discovered? Lake drummed his fingers on the desk. If you mean the nephew was framed, I do not mean anything yet, I merely notice. One must notice, you see. The inspector muttered something about magistrates and procedure. He had the case he needed. He did not wish to unravel it. But Miss Marple, walking home past the quiet hedges, knew that what was comfortable for the law was not always comfortable for truth. That evening, as the village gathered in the church hall for choir practice, small whispers rustled like dry leaves. Mrs. Hart recounted how James had asked her for chalk and how clever she had been to refuse. Mrs. Lydgate told anyone who would listen that she had warned Lydia against indulgence to nephews. Hetty sat hunched, murmuring prayers beneath her breath. Everyone, it seemed, was certain the matter was finished. Everyone, that is, but Miss Marple. She sat by the stove, listening to the sopranos stumble through their part, and thought of a missing paper knife, a smudge of chalk imperfectly wiped, and a curl of mother-of-pearl scraped under a hedge. James Ransom was guilty of many faults, but the quiet art of misdirection was not among them. Someone else had arranged the stage, hidden behind the curtain while the nephew took his bow as villain. She closed her eyes briefly, as though lulled by the hymn, but her mind was alive, circling the maze. A false victory had been declared, but she felt in her bones that the true hand still moved in shadow, waiting. Murderers, she knew, are patient when they believe they have been clever. And in St. Mary Mead, cleverness was always more dangerous than greed. The next Sunday dawned with deceptive serenity. Bells chimed across St. Mary Mead, summoning villagers to service, their notes floating above neat hedges and the smell of freshly baked bread. Life, it seemed, resumed its respectable rhythm. Yet Miss Marple sat quietly in her pew, eyes lowered, on her prayer book, while her mind reached back and back, tugging at threads that had not yet been drawn to the surface. She felt the way one feels a draught in a closed room, something left ajar, something from long ago still moving among them. After the service, she lingered in the churchyard, nodding to acquaintances until Mrs. Lydgate approached. The vicar's wife was brisk, carrying her hymn book like a shield. So dreadful about Lydia Ransom, isn't it? Such a respectable woman, never gave anyone the slightest trouble, until her nephew, of course. You know, she came to the Harvest Jumble meeting years ago with rather forceful opinions about the quilt. I dare say she enjoyed ordering others about. Years ago, Miss Marple asked gently. Oh, 4 or 5, Mrs. Lydgate said with a little sniff. I remember distinctly because she insisted on bottle green then as well. We refused her. Lydia never quite forgave me. Bottle green. Again that colour. Miss Marple let the remark rest, but her mind began turning the reels of memory. 4 or 5 years ago. That had been the same year the matter of Mrs. Price's maid came to light, the one accused of pilfering lace and dismissed without a reference. Miss Marple remembered because Mrs. Ransom had lent her name to the accusation. She had insisted she had seen the maid near the sewing box, lifting a spool, but the evidence had never been quite sound. The poor girl had left the village ruined, her family scattered, and here again was a sewing box, a reel of thread, and a stain upon character. Was it chance or habit? Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the Swan, where Inspector Lake was attempting to eat a chop in peace. "I wonder," she began mildly, "if you recall the case of Mrs. Price's maid, Agnes. It was never quite proven, was it?" Lake frowned, knife and fork poised. "Before my time. But I've heard—" "Gossip, maid accused of theft, dismissed. Why?" "Because it was Lydia Ransom's testimony that condemned her," Miss Marple said, "and Lydia had a particular fondness for appearing just so in such matters. She enjoyed being the final word. It occurs to me that in both cases, a theft then, a murder now, the sewing box sits at the heart of things. Once a maid's ruin, now a nephew's guilt." Lake set down his knife. "Are you saying Mrs. Ransom herself lied then, or that someone else used her reputation to advantage?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Reputations can be as useful as daggers." They wound silently. She left him troubled and walked on to Mrs. Hart's shop. The bell rang as she entered, and the shopkeeper bustled forward. "Needles again, Miss Marple? Or thread?" "I've still some white, though not much call for it." "I wondered," Miss Marple said, "if you recall who bought bottle green from you years ago. Not last week, but some time before, perhaps during the business of the harvest jumble quilt." Mrs. Hart pursed her lips, pleased to be consulted. "Why, yes. Mrs. Ransom herself insisted on it, but also that Mr. Garrett, he came in with her once, if I remember rightly, bought 2 reels. Odd for a gentleman, I thought, but he said it was for account stringing. I never quite believed him." Miss Marple tucked this away. Garrett again. Thread, codicils, legacies, always hovering near money, near documents, near the small things that bind lives together. That evening, she invited Hetty Pike to tea. The woman came nervously, smoothing her apron. Over the cups, Miss Marple spoke gently. "You must have known Mrs. Ransom well, Hetty. Did she ever speak of her sister in Cheltenham?" "Oh, yes, miss. Wrote her every week. But truth be told, they quarrelled years ago. About a legacy from their father, I believe. The sister claimed Lydia took more than her share, and Lydia said she only took what was due. There was no speaking between them for months. That was the year Agnes the maid was dismissed. I remember because Lydia said—" She broke off, glancing, up in alarm. "Do go on, dear." Hetty lowered her voice. She said, "Better to let a servant go with disgrace than to have a sister expose me." I never quite understood, miss, but it frightened me. Lydia had a way of smiling when she said things like that. Shadows lengthened on the tablecloth as Miss Marple poured a little more tea. Old quarrels, old legacies, old accusations, all stitched into the present like invisible seams. What? If Lydia Ransom's murder was not about James's debts at all, but about a reckoning long postponed. She thought again of the missing paper knife. Not a weapon one carries into a quarrel, but one already in the room, part of the furnishings. Easy for a hand familiar with the cottage to seize. And the dagger. Too ornate, too pointedly placed. It reminded her of Lydia's earlier testimony against Agnes. Too pat, too convenient, designed to make guilt seem obvious. Was someone repeating that trick now, arranging the scene so that James bore the same stain of certainty the maid once had? If so, who but someone who remembered that old scandal, someone who had lived through it and profited by it? The following day brought confirmation in the most ordinary form. The postman, Mr. Ellison, came by with letters, one of them redirected from Cheltenham. Miss Marple, who had a way of seeing what others overlooked, noticed the faint smudge of blue ink on the envelope. It was addressed to Mrs. Ransom from her sister. The letter, when opened by the inspector, proved to be nothing more than a complaint about Lydia's coldness and a query about the father's estate. But to Miss Marple it rang like a church bell. Here was the past, knocking again, refusing to be silent. She walked once more to the cottage and stood before the mirror with its chalk smear. In its reflection, she imagined Lydia years ago, standing, proud, accusing Agnes of theft. She imagined Garrett beside her in the shop, buying thread under false pretenses. She imagined Mrs. Lydgate fretting over quilts, resenting Lydia's interference. Each had a tie, however thin, to that long ago quarrel. Motives in the present were but the flowering of seeds sown years before. When she returned home, she wrote a few careful notes on the back of an old sermon leaflet: thread, codicil, legacy, sister, Agnes, knife, blue ink. Each word linked to another. Greed alone did not explain it, nor jealousy, nor fear. It was pride, pride born years ago, pride that demanded to be right, to arrange appearances, to cast guilt neatly where it would stick. And in that pride lay the key. Whoever had staged Lydia's death had studied her old ways, her old cases. They had learned how she herself once used appearance to ruin a maid, and they had copied the method. The past was not finished. It had returned, dressed in bottle green. Miss Marple set down her pen and folded her hands. She did not yet know the whole embroidery, but she knew this much. The true murderer was not simply silencing Lydia Ransom for money or inheritance. They were avenging, correcting, or perhaps repeating an old deception. And until that was seen, plainly the village would rest easy in a false story, while the real criminal still moved freely in their midst. The roses at Hawthorne Cottage, she thought, had scattered petals once before, when a servant girl wept into them after her dismissal. Now they scattered again, bearing witness to another ruin. The past, like thread drawn too tightly, had pulled the present into knots, and Miss Marple knew she must be the one to unpick them. Inspector Lake had all but convinced himself the case was closed. James Ransom would be charged, his debts and confession enough to seal a tidy narrative. Yet Miss Marple remained unsatisfied, and in her quiet way she pressed for a final gathering at Hawthorne Cottage before the magistrates set matters in stone. Lake indulged her, more to pacify than from conviction. The air inside the cottage was heavy, though the windows had been opened. Dust motes hung in the sunbeams, suspended like secrets. Around the table sat those touched by the affair: James, pale and resentful; Mr. Garrard, smooth and untroubled; Mrs. Lydgate, clutching her gloves as if they might shield her; Hetty Pike, nervous, twisting her apron; Mrs. Hart, with lips pursed in relish at being included. Miss Marple stood, her knitting bag at her side. She looked less like a detective than an elderly aunt about to remind them of propriety, which suited her purpose well. "We are gathered," she began gently, "because Lydia Ransom deserves truth, not mere convenience. And sometimes truth hides where one least expects. I should like to try a little experiment." Inspector Lake arched a brow but said nothing. From her bag, Miss Marple withdrew a simple bolt from the cottage door, removed at her request by Mr. Sims the smith. She placed it on the table, along with a length of white thread, a length of bottle green, and a stub of tailor's chalk. "We have heard much," she said softly, "about how a bolt might be drawn by string. The theory is sound, but theory and practice are different matters. I should like to see how each of us would attempt it." James gave a short laugh. "This is absurd. I told you I never—" "Indulge me," Miss Marple said, her eyes kind, her tone mild but firm. "Merely to see how hands behave when set to a task." The thread and bolt passed round the table. James went first, fumbling, his fingers clumsy, the thread slipping uselessly. "See?" he said bitterly. "It's nonsense." Garrard smiled his practiced smile and tried with professional elegance. He managed a loop, but pulled too sharply, snapping the thread. "Not a practical method," he declared smoothly. "Better? Left to conjurers." Mrs. Lydgate demurred, saying she had never the knack for knots. She touched the thread but produced nothing beyond a tangle, her lips pressed tight with frustration at the failure. Hetty, timid, made an attempt. Her hands, roughened by years of scrubbing, could not tie the fine knot. She blushed, apologizing. "I'm no good at tricks, miss. Never was." Mrs. Hart seized the opportunity with relish. "I pride myself on nimble fingers," she said. But her effort yielded little. She tied a knot but left it visible and clumsy. She flushed, muttering that no decent woman should know such things anyway. All the while Miss Marple watched, not the knots themselves, but the manner of each person's attempt. James impatient, Garrard theatrical, Mrs. Lydgate fretful, Hetty flustered, Mrs. Hart self-important. Each revealed themselves in small gestures, but Miss Marple was looking for something subtler. At last she reached for the bolt herself. Her hands were steady as she threaded the white cotton through with the smallest of loops. "There," she said, and the bolt slid home with a neatness that surprised even Lake. It is not strength one requires, but delicacy. A hand accustomed. Toe sewing to drawing a thread through cloth would find it simple. It is not a man's trick, but a woman's. The room went still. Garrett gave a short laugh, though a flicker of unease crossed his face. Then we must accuse all of St. Mary. Mead Miss Marple, for every woman here has sewn a seam. Perhaps, she agreed mildly. Yet only one among us thought to place the dagger in the sewing box, where it sat not quite straight. That speaks of a familiarity with such boxes, with what they should look like. A man might use one, but he would not know its language. Only, a woman who has lived with it daily would betray herself so. Her eyes travelled slowly to Mrs. Lydgate. The vicar's wife shifted, her gloves twisting in her lap. "You cannot think," she began, her voice high. "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that you noticed Lydia's fondness for bottle green long ago. You disapproved of it in the quilt, yet when she bought it again last week, you recalled it, and your disapproval deepened into something darker. Lydia had power in our village. She could sway decisions, ruin reputations, as poor Agnes the maid discovered years ago. And she could dismiss your work as too fussy, your timing as too rigid. Pride, Mrs. Lydgate, can be a sharper weapon than any knife." Mrs. Lydgate's face paled. "You are inventing motives out of gossip." "Not inventing," Miss Marple said, her tone as soft as falling petals. "Noticing. When we spoke after church, you told me Lydia had insisted on bottle green, years ago. You remembered that too well for it not to matter, and your account of your movements that morning shifted like sand, before the quarter, after the quarter. Exact women do not misplace time unless they must." Inspector Lake leaned forward. "Are you accusing—" But Miss Marple raised a hand. "Not accusing, Inspector. Only observing. One more thing." She lifted the stub of chalk. "Someone wiped a mark from the bedroom mirror. White chalk, I believe, not blue. A careful woman with a habit of sewing near glass light might steady her thread that way. And Mrs. Lydgate, when I visited, I noticed a small dusting of powder on your sleeve, which is curious for a woman who never powders her clothes." The vicar's wife trembled, her lips working soundlessly. At last she burst out, "She humiliated me," always so sure of herself, always correcting me. "She meant to cut me out of the jumble entirely, me who had organized it for years. She laughed when I said the quilt must be simple. She said I had no taste after all my efforts." Her voice cracked, a cry as much of wounded pride as guilt. The silence that followed was heavy. Even Garrett, usually smooth, sat stiffly, his smile gone. James stared, astonished, while Hetty crossed herself. Miss Marple spoke gently. "Pride. Mrs. Lydgate can unpick even the neatest seams. You sought to stage a scene as Lydia once staged one for poor Agnes, making guilt seem obvious where it was not. You placed the dagger in the sewing box. You drew the bolt with a thread. You left James to bear the blame. And you would have succeeded, had you not forgotten that a sewing box, like a parish, demands straightness. That is why the dagger lay askew." Mrs. Lydgate bowed her head into her gloves, shoulders shaking. Inspector Lake signalled to his constables, but Miss Marple's eyes were sad. "It is not greed alone that kills, Inspector," she murmured. "Sometimes it is the wound of pride, stitched again and again until the cloth will not hold." The unconventional test had done its work. A bolt, a thread, and a quiet eye had revealed what routine could not. And in the hush of the little cottage, Miss Marple saw once more how the smallest details, overlooked by all, can unravel the most elaborate deception. Inspector Lake had scarcely drawn breath from the confession that spilled out of Mrs. Lydgate, when the case took another turn, as sudden and unsettling as a draught blowing through a closed church. He had secured her in the vestry at the vicarage under constable's watch, intending to prepare his report for the magistrates. Miss Marple, though, had warned him softly that pride alone does not explain everything, that a murderer, cornered, might yet find a way to unravel the neatness of law. By the next morning, her words proved prophetic. The dagger, the very weapon taken from Lydia Ransom's sewing box, wrapped in brown paper, and sealed in the constabulary's cabinet, was gone. The constable responsible swore the lock had not been tampered with. Yet when the cabinet was opened, only the paper remained, slit carefully at one edge. The weapon had vanished as though it had grown wings. Lake was furious. "Sabotage," he shouted, pacing the Swan's parlour, hat clutched in one fist. "The one piece of evidence linking the act itself, gone. Without it, the magistrate may, well, dismiss the charge for want of substance. Blast it all, who knew where we kept it?" Miss Marple, seated in her usual modest posture, knitted serenely. "Everyone who wished to know, Inspector. Gossip carries as easily as thistledown. But what interests me is not that the dagger is missing, but that someone believed it important to remove." Important. It was the murder weapon. Miss Marple shook her head. "Or rather, it was meant to appear so. We already doubted its authenticity, yet someone feared it might betray more than it concealed. That, Inspector, is quite revealing." Lake groaned. "You mean someone else, not Mrs. Lydgate, has meddled?" "I mean," Miss Marple said gently, "that the threads of pride and deceit we saw in Mrs. Lydgate may be only part of a larger embroidery. We must ask who had the boldness to reach into police hands, and what they hoped to erase." The village bristled with speculation. James Ransom, released on account of Lydgate's breakdown, muttered loudly in the Swan that the police had bungled, and that his life had been ruined by gossip. Mrs. Hart announced to all who entered her shop that thieves must be abroad, and that she had always said the constabulary should keep better watch. Hetty Pike grew paler each day, claiming she heard noises in the cottage at night, shadows moving by the hedge. Mr. Garrod, polished as ever, expressed sympathy, but suggested that the weapon's disappearance only proved James's friends in Ski. London had influence. Each explanation tangled more tightly. Miss Marple, however, kept her thoughts close. She asked one afternoon to walk through Hawthorne Cottage again. The rooms were silent now, the air stale with disuse. In the sitting room, the sewing box still sat upon its table, its compartments neat, its reels aligned. Yet something was different. Miss Marple leaned close. The reel of white thread was gone. Only the bottle green remained. She touched the empty compartment gently. "Now, why would someone remove that?" she murmured. "Not valuable, not incriminating, unless—" She let the thought drift, but her eyes grew sharp. That evening, the inspector summoned all concerned to the Swan's parlour, hoping to smoke out the culprit by pressure. The group assembled reluctantly, James sulking, Garrod composed, Mrs. Hart eager for drama, Hetty trembling like a leaf. "The dagger is missing," Lake declared flatly. "Taken from police custody. And now, the reel of white thread from Mrs. Ransom's box has also disappeared. Whoever is tampering with evidence will find themselves in the dock alongside Mrs. Lydgate, if we discover the truth." Gasps and murmurs followed. Mrs. Hart clutched her shawl. "Well, I never! White thread! Why, I sold that to her myself. Needles, too. What possible reason would anyone have—" "Perhaps," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "because white thread was the true instrument of the bolt trick. Bottle green is too conspicuous. Only white would vanish against a cream door. Whoever removed it hoped to bury the proof of cunning. A dagger can be replaced, but thread leaves no mark if it is gone." Her words fell into the silence like stones into a well. James shifted uneasily. Hetty clasped her hands tighter. Garrod raised a brow, smiling faintly. "A bold deduction," he said. "But then what of Mrs. Lydgate's confession, pride and humiliation? Was that not motive enough?" "Confessions," Miss Marple said softly, "are like seed cake, too neat when sliced and rarely eaten whole. Mrs. Lydgate's pride may have led her to wish Lydia ill, but she did not possess the daring to creep into the constabulary and steal evidence. That required both calculation and confidence, qualities found elsewhere." Lake looked from face to face. "Then one of you here interfered." "Which?" The silence stretched. A cart rattled past outside, its wheels crunching. "Gravel." At last Hetty spoke, voice trembling. "Not me, sir. I wouldn't dare. I've not even been near the station." Mrs. Hart sniffed. "Nor I. My shop keeps me busy. Besides, what would I want with thread or daggers?" James lifted his chin. "I've suffered enough. Do you think I'd sneak back to prolong it?" Only Garrod smiled, smooth as ever. "Really? Inspector, are we to suspect everyone in the parish? St. Mary Mead is not a nest of thieves." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, but it has always been a nest of secrets. And secrets, Mr. Garrett, are harder to keep than daggers. Her eyes lingered on him a moment longer than courtesy required. He did not flinch, but his smile thinned. Miss Marple tucked her knitting back into her bag. She knew now that the disappearance of the evidence was not panic, but strategy. Someone sought not only to conceal the true method, but to shift suspicion again. That night she wrote a single line on her sermon leaflet. The one who steals evidence fears the past more than the present. The stakes had risen. With the dagger and thread gone, trust itself became fragile. The constabulary looked foolish, the villagers restless, and Miss Marple, though outwardly serene, felt the old familiar chill. The murderer was not finished yet. They were still at work, still weaving, still pulling threads tight. The false victory had been stripped away. Now the real battle for truth would begin. The village had begun to settle again, lulled by the idea that Lydia Ransom's death, however tragic, was neatly explained. Mrs. Lydgate had confessed, James had been released, and the whispers that once filled shop and churchyard now dwindled into sighs. But Miss Marple knew better. Villages, like sewing boxes, only look tidy until one lifts the lid. And with the dagger and thread both vanished, she felt that familiar prickle along her spine, the sense that someone was still arranging the stage. It was on a damp Thursday morning that the illusion shattered. The postman, Mr. Ellison, burst into the Swan where Inspector Lake was taking breakfast. His cap was askew, his face pale. "Another one," he stammered. "At the vicarage. Mrs. Lydgate. She's gone." Lake pushed back his chair. "Gone?" "Vanished." Ellison gasped. "Her bed not slept in. The vicar says she left her gloves on the hall table, her prayer book beside them. Front door unbolted, back door wide open. No note, no word." Within the hour, the vicarage was a flurry of boots and whispers. The vicar himself wrung his hands, repeating that his wife had been overwrought but never reckless. Her gloves, indeed, sat neatly side by side on the hall table. A teacup in the kitchen bore the faintest smear of lipstick. By the scullery door, mud tracked inward in a neat line, as though someone had stepped carefully, purposefully. Miss Marple stood by the threshold, eyes lowered. She had seen such neat vanishings before. "This is not flight," she said softly. "This is arrangement. Someone wished her absence to be noticed." Lake's patience frayed. "She confessed, Miss Marple. Why vanish if not from guilt?" "Because," Miss Marple murmured, "her confession was useful to someone else. And usefulness once spent becomes dangerous." By noon, a grim discovery confirmed her suspicion. A boy gathering kindling near the mill pond cried out, and soon half the village stood staring at the water, where a lady's hat floated, its ribbon torn. Dragging the pond brought up not Mrs. Lydgate, but only her shawl, sodden and heavy. No body appeared. It was disappearance masquerading as death. The village, unsettled, buzzed anew. Some declared she had drowned herself in shame. Others whispered she had fled to relatives in Bath. But Miss Marple's mind traced a different thread. If Mrs. Lydgate had been silenced, then the true culprit was ruthless indeed, tying off loose ends as neatly as stitches in a hem. That evening Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, her knitting untouched. She thought of the vanished dagger, the missing reel of thread, and now a vanished woman. Each piece of evidence had slipped away just as it grew important. It was not panic, it was orchestration. Someone was still at work, still weaving the pattern to their design. Her reverie was broken by a soft tap at her window. Hetty Pike stood outside, shawl clutched tight, eyes wide with fear. Miss Marple admitted her, and the woman collapsed into a chair. "I can't sleep, miss. Every night I hear footsteps near the cottage. Last night I saw a light inside, though the constables swear it's locked. And now Mrs. Lydgate gone, it's as if the dead are walking." "Not the dead, Hetty," Miss Marple said kindly. "Only the living, who wish us to believe in ghosts, do." "You think—" Hetty hesitated, then whispered, "Do you think they'll come for me next?" "Mrs. Ransom promised to leave me something in her will. Maybe that's why—" Her voice faltered. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Ah, a promise. Did anyone else know of it?" "Mr. Garrett," Hetty admitted reluctantly. He asked about Kate when he came with papers, said she might wish to show gratitude. He smiled when he said it, but it made my skin crawl. When Hetty left, Miss Marple sat very still. A pattern was forming, dark and careful. Garrod with his codicils, his thread purchases, his smooth evasions. Garrod, who had most to lose if Lydia's papers revealed unflattering truths. Garrod, who would know how to stage appearances and remove incriminating objects from official custody. And now Mrs. Lydgate gone, perhaps dead, perhaps hidden. Either way, a witness erased. The next morning Miss Marple went to see Inspector Lake, who was glowering over a muddied hat and shawl spread across his desk. "It is too neat, Inspector," she said gently. "Mrs. Lydgate's confession, her disappearance, the dagger, the thread, all arranged. This is not a series of blunders, it is a design." Lake scowled. "You mean Garrod?" "I mean," Miss Marple said, "that Garrod is a man who deals in papers and appearances. If Mrs. Ransom suspected him of deceit, if she meant to change her will, that could not be allowed. He might persuade a woman like Mrs. Lydgate to play a part, to confess in exchange for some promise. But once she had spoken, she became dangerous." "And so she is gone," Lake muttered. "But without proof—" "Proof," Miss Marple said softly, "is like thread. Pull gently, and the seam will open. But one must be quick, Inspector, for I believe our adversary has not finished." "A second. Crime has already darkened the village. A third may follow if we do not act." That night, as she drew her curtains, Miss Marple felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her. Someone, she knew, was watching, making certain she too remained within the pattern. She did not flinch. She had lived too long among village feuds and petty vanities to fear shadows. But she also knew this. The next move would not be against servants or vicars' wives. The next move might be against her. For when a murderer sees that the truth is close, they strike not at the past, but at the present. And in St. Mary Mead, the present had never felt so precarious. By Friday, the whole of St. Mary Mead seemed suspended between gossip and dread. The pond had yielded no body, yet Mrs. Lydgate had vanished. The dagger and thread were gone. James Ransom stalked the green, muttering of injustice, and Mr. Garrod, smooth as silk, continued to express his regret with precisely the right degree of sadness. It was chaos disguised as order, and Inspector Lake, weary of contradictions, confessed to Miss Marple that he wished he had never heard the name Lydia Ransom. But Miss Marple, who spent that afternoon watering her roses, felt a curious calm. Out of the muddle a shape was beginning to form, faint as a watermark on paper, but there. She recalled Lydia's cream blouse with its red star, the sugar-smeared cup, the spoon wiped clean by Hetty, the bolt drawn by thread, the dagger that wished to be found, the missing ivory paper knife, the chalk on the mirror, the reel of white that had vanished later. Each by itself was nothing. Together they whispered of a mind that loved neatness, staging and appearances. The moment of recognition came not from the evidence, but from an offhand remark at Mrs. Hart's shop. Miss Marple had gone in for a packet of pins. Mrs. Hart, bursting with self-importance, declared, "What this case proves, Miss Marple, is that you can always tell the truth of a matter by how a sewing box is arranged. Mrs. Ransom's was always perfect, never a reel out of place." And suddenly, like the click of a clasp, everything fell into place, because Miss Marple remembered, when the dagger had been found in that sewing box, it had been lying askew, not straight. Only someone familiar with its usual order would think to place it at all, and yet fail to place it quite right. A stranger would never have dared touch it. Only someone who knew Mrs. Ransom's sewing habits intimately, and yet was not used to living with them, could make such a blunder. She walked slowly home, the thought ripening. Who had been in and out of that cottage? Who knew its order and its rules but did not belong to it? Who dealt in appearances, in papers, in staged impressions? Who was bold enough to slip into the constabulary and remove evidence? Who smiled too much when others quailed? By dusk she was ready. She asked Inspector Lake to gather them again in the sitting room of Hawthorne Cottage. He grumbled but obeyed. He had learned that when Miss Marple looked so mild, danger often lurked behind her knitting. They came, James resentful, Hetty, pale, Mrs. Hart, eager, Garrod, perfectly turned out, tie-pin gleaming. The cottage smelled faintly of lavender. Still, though the air was heavy with expectation, Miss Marple sat by the hearth, hands folded. "We have lived through confusion," she began, "but at last the pattern shows itself, and the pattern, as ever, lies in the small things." Her eyes rested on James. "You quarrelled with your aunt, but you are too clumsy for thread tricks. You would have snatched a knife, not staged a play." She turned to Hetty. "You wiped the spoon, poor soul, but you have neither the daring nor the cruelty for murder. Fear drives you, not pride." Mrs. Hart opened her mouth, but Miss Marple's glance silenced her. "And you, dear Mrs. Hart, delight in gossip, but your hands betrayed you when you tried the bolt. You could never have managed such neatness." Finally, she looked at Garrod. "But you, Mr. Garrod, you are a man of appearances. You arrange papers, wills, codicils. You flatter, you smile, you make things look just so. And when you placed the dagger in the sewing box, you forgot that reels of thread are always straight, never diagonal. You imitated order, but you did not live with it. That was your mistake." Garrod laughed lightly. "Really, Miss Marple, you give me too much credit. Why should I?" "Because Lydia Ransom discovered you had cheated her," Miss Marple said, calmly. "She meant to change her will, to disinherit you from even the small commissions you drew from her accounts. You feared exposure, not from James or Hetty, but from Lydia herself. So you staged a scene, borrowing the trick of thread and bolt from village talk, and meant us to believe her quarrelsome nephew guilty. And when Mrs. Lydgate babbled her confession, whether from pride or confusion, you used it as cover. But she too became dangerous, and so she vanished." The silence was sharp as glass. Garrod's smile thinned, but he did not speak. Inspector Lake rose. "I have no proof, Miss Marple, only words." "Words are proof, Inspector, if you listen." She reached into her knitting bag and drew out a reel of thread, white. "When I visited the cottage yesterday, I saw the white reel was gone. Yet here it is. I found it tucked under the lining of Mrs. Ransom's work basket, where it had slipped when someone unfamiliar with such baskets tried to remove it. Someone, I suspect, who thought only of hiding evidence, not of how thread unwinds. The fibres. On it match the chalk smear on the mirror. That is proof enough." For the first time, Garrod's composure cracked. His hand twitched, as though to rise, then stilled. His eyes darted to the window, to the door, to the constables at either side. Miss Marple's voice was almost tender. "It is always the little things, Mr. Garrod. A spoon wiped clean, a reel placed wrong, a thread chosen too bold. Murderers think in terms of weapons and alibis, but it is the habits of everyday life, the straightness of reels, the tidiness of trays that betray them." Lake snapped his fingers and the constables closed in. Garrod did not resist. His smile was gone, his shoulders slumped. Hetty crossed herself. James exhaled sharply, as if years of debt had just been lifted. Mrs. Hart murmured that she had always suspected something of the kind. But Miss Marple only looked down at her knitting. "Order, Inspector, that is what it comes to. Mrs. Ransom liked things straight, and when the pattern was crooked, she told us so." In the hush that followed, the pattern of the whole affair shone clear at last. Greed masters charm, pride exploited as cover, innocence tangled in lies. The chaos had been dreadful, but the truth as ever lay in plain sight, waiting for the right eye to notice. Inspector Lake, satisfied at last to have Garrod in custody, spent the night drafting his report. He listed motive as financial gain, method as trickery with thread, and opportunity as his long acquaintance with Lydia Ransom's accounts. It was thorough, competent, respectable, yet when he read it back it sounded curiously flat, as though a page were missing from a book. Miss Marple, in her quiet way, knew why. Greed explained Garrod's actions only in part. Men have killed. For less, it is true, but something about the elaborate staging of the scene, the vanishing of evidence, the manipulation of Mrs. Lydgate, suggested a deeper wound. A greedy man seizes, he does not embroider. This crime had been embroidered stitch by stitch. She requested, therefore, a final interview with Garrod before he was taken to the county jail. Lake agreed reluctantly, and so it was that the three of them sat in the dim light of the constabulary's interview room. Garrod, pale but composed, Lake, notebook in hand, and Miss Marple, her knitting needles silent in her lap. "Mr. Garrod," she began softly, "money may have hurried your hand, but it was not money alone. Lydia Ransom knew something, did she not? Something you could not bear the world to hear." Garrod gave his usual smile, though it looked more like a crack in porcelain than confidence. "How you make it sound like melodrama, Miss Marple. Lydia was an interfering woman who threatened to alter her will, that is all." Miss Marple shook her head. "If that were all, you would have contrived a simpler accident. A slip on the stairs, perhaps, or a fall in the garden. But you staged a locked-room mystery. You removed and replaced evidence. You drove Mrs. Lydgate to a false confession. That is not the work of a man merely protecting a commission. That is the work of someone protecting himself, his very identity." Lake frowned. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" She looked at Garrod gently, as though she were coaxing a child. Years ago, when Agnes the maid was dismissed, there was gossip that she had been tempted into mischief by someone in the village. A gentleman who promised her marriage then cast her off. Lydia swore she had seen Agnes with the sewing box, stealing. But in truth, Agnes was covering for another. Wasn't she, Mr. Garrod? She was shielding you. Garrod's smile faltered. His hands, so steady when producing papers for clients, trembled. "Ridiculous, that girl was a thief, everyone knew it." "Not everyone," Miss Marple said softly. "Some of us doubted. She left in disgrace, her reputation ruined. But she carried your child, did she not? Lydia discovered it later. She had a way of discovering such things. She used that knowledge to bind you to her. Perhaps she threatened exposure. Perhaps she demanded that you keep her affairs discreet. Either way, she held a thread around your throat, and you could not breathe until she was silent." Lake looked sharply at Garrod. "Is this true?" Garrod's face hardened. The mask slipped, revealing something raw beneath. "Do you know what it is, Inspector, to be at the mercy of a woman who smiles while she destroys you? Lydia enjoyed it. She reminded me often how Agnes wept, how the child died before its first breath. She said I should be grateful she had not spoken to the world. Grateful, while she held me in chains all these years." His voice cracked, rising in pitch, then fell again into a bitter whisper. "I would have endured if she had merely wanted money. But she wanted power. She wanted me humiliated, bound to her like a servant. Every codicil, every paper I drew for her was a leash. She liked to watch me squirm." Miss Marple's eyes were kind but steady. "And so you squirmed free, by killing her." Garrod's laugh was hollow. "I gave her what she had given Agnes, ruin. Only mine was permanent." Inspector Lake, shaken, pressed on. "You involved Mrs. Lydgate?" Garrod sneered faintly. "A useful fool. She despised Lydia for her arrogance, so I played upon that. A word here, a suggestion there, and she convinced herself she had struck the blow in spirit, if not in deed. She made her confession willingly, poor vain creature. But she became inconvenient, so I let her vanish. Fear does the rest." Lake shut his notebook with a snap. "So it wasn't money, but blackmail." "Worse than blackmail," Miss Marple corrected gently. "It was humiliation, long and sustained. Lydia Ransom stitched people into her tidy patterns, and Garrod became her unwilling embroidery. Pride can kill, Inspector, but so can shame." Garrod sagged back in his chair, spent. "Do what you will, at least you will never smile at me again." Later, walking home beneath the fading light, Miss Marple reflected. The village would say, "Garrod killed for greed. It was simpler, easier to digest with their tea." But she knew the deeper truth. He had killed because Lydia Ransom had held him in her power for years, feeding on the secret of Agnes's ruin. He had killed not to gain, but to escape. And that, she thought sadly, is the most dangerous motive of all. A man who kills for gain may be satisfied once he has it, but a man who kills to free himself will stop at nothing until the chain is broken. The roses at Hawthorne Cottage still scattered their petals, heedless of scandal. But Miss Marple knew that beneath their beauty lay the darker soil of secrets, old sins buried, roots twisting beneath the surface. And she knew, too, that though the pattern had been dreadful, it had been clear all along. The sewing box, the thread, the mislaid knife, all pointing not to money, but to pride, shame, and the hidden power one life can hold over another. Inspector. Lake insisted that the formal handover of Garrett to the county authorities should be done without delay. But Miss Marple, sitting by the hearth of the Swan with her knitting folded neatly in her lap, requested one more evening. "Inspector," she said, her voice mild as cream, "you have his words, yes, and his motive half revealed. But what we lack is closure. He has not yet faced the truth of what he has done. Without that, he may wriggle free in a court where charm is valued more than conscience. Allow me one small chance to make the matter plain." Lake sighed, accustomed by now to these gentle but immovable requests. "What do you propose?" "A gathering," Miss Marple said, "in the very room where Lydia Ransom died. Let those touched by the case be present. James, Hetty, Mrs. Hart, if she insists. And Garrett, of course. We shall speak of the past and see what comes of it." And so, as dusk fell over St. Mary Mead, Hawthorne Cottage lit its lamps once more. The roses outside drooped with evening dew, their petals scattered like confetti across the path. Inside, the sitting room had been restored as nearly as possible. Lydia's chair by the hearth, the tea tray returned to the table, the sewing box in its rightful place. A curious hush lay over the room, as though the very walls waited for confession. James Ransom leaned against the mantel, nervous and restless. Hetty Pike sat stiffly near the window, wringing her hands. Mrs. Hart perched like a crow on a chair edge, eyes gleaming with the prospect of drama. Garrett entered last, his composure intact, though his tie was a little loose and his eyes glittered with a strained brightness. Miss Marple remained by the table, her hands resting lightly on the sewing box. "We are here," she began, "because truth must be spoken where falsehood has been staged. Mr. Garrett, you arranged this scene once before. Let us arrange it again, and see if the pattern holds." Garrett gave a laugh, dry and brittle. "Really, Miss Marple, must we play at theatricals?" "It is no play," she said softly. "It is remembrance. Lydia Ransom died here, stabbed with a weapon chosen not for its utility, but for its appearance. You planted the dagger in her sewing box, knowing it would be found and so lead suspicion to James. You drew the bolt with thread, then erased the evidence. You silenced Mrs. Lydgate when she became inconvenient, and you thought yourself clever enough to vanish the truth along with the weapon." Garrett's smile widened, but it did not reach his eyes. "And yet you claim to know all, Miss Marple. Then do explain. Why should I go to such lengths for a widow of modest means? It makes no sense." "Because," Miss Marple said, her voice still gentle, "Lydia Ransom knew what you had done to Agnes. She knew of the child. She reminded you of it often, holding your shame like a leash. It was not money you feared losing, but your mask. You killed not to gain, but to be free." For the first time the mask slipped. Garrett's hand tightened on the back of a chair, the knuckles white. A silence fell, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Miss Marple lifted the sewing box lid. Inside lay reels of thread, white and green, restored by her own hand, and the thimble and tape. And there, straight and neat, the ivory paper knife, its point faintly stained where mother-of-pearl had once flaked. "You overlooked this, Mr. Garrett. The true weapon was not the ornate dagger, but this. Familiar at hand, easily cleaned, easily replaced. The dagger was theatre, the knife was truth, and when you scraped its handle, a flake fell beneath the hedge. I picked it up myself." Garrett's breath caught. "That proves nothing." "It proves enough," Miss Marple replied, "because only one who staged the scene would remove the dagger later from police custody, fearing that its falseness would betray the truth. And only one would take the reel of white thread, not realizing that I had already seen it. Every act of concealment, Mr. Garrett, has been your confession." Lake stepped forward. "We have your confession already, man. Spare yourself further shame." But Garrett's composure cracked fully now. He looked around the room at James glaring, at Hetty trembling, at Mrs. Hart drinking in every detail for tomorrow's retelling. His voice rose, sharp with bitterness. "Do you understand what it is to be laughed at by a woman who holds your ruin in her hand?" Lydia smiled when she spoke of Agnes. She smiled when she said the child's grave would be my monument. For years she bound me with that smile. I could not endure it. So I silenced it forever. The words rang in the little room, stark and terrible. Miss Marple lowered the sewing-box lid with a quiet click. "And yet, Mr. Garrett, it is not Lydia who will be remembered now, but you. That is the irony of pride. You killed to free yourself from a chain, but you have forged another heavier than any before." Garrett straightened suddenly, as though some last desperate thought took hold. His eyes darted to the window, but Lake's constables were ready, and before he could move they held him fast. The fight drained from him, his head dropped. The room exhaled as though released from a spell. James muttered a curse under his breath. Hetty began to cry softly. Mrs. Hart whispered that she had always said it was Garrett, though no one listened. Inspector Lake turned to Miss Marple, shaking his head with mingled admiration and disbelief. "You set the trap well, madam. But shall not deny I've never seen a man undone by a reel of thread in a sewing-box before." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is the small things, Inspector. They always tell. Murderers think in terms of weapons and alibis, but lives are stitched together by habits, and habits are what betray us." As Garrett was led away, Miss Marple touched the roses by the window. Their petals had fallen thick on the sill, white and crimson mingled. The pattern of the case was finished at last, but the lesson remained. Pride and shame, secrets and appearances, they weave the darkest embroideries of all. And she, with her quiet eye and patient hand, had only unpicked the stitches until the truth lay bare. Outside, the evening settled into peace. But in the quiet of Hawthorne Cottage, where a woman's chair still stood empty by the hearth, the air held the echo of that final confrontation, an echo that would not fade soon from the memory of St. Mary Mead. The evening after Garrett's arrest, St. Mary Mead exhaled with relief. At last, villagers said, the whole dreadful affair was behind them. Mrs. Hart folded it into her shop gossip. James drank at the Swan with a sense of vindication. Hetty prayed for her mistress's soul with trembling sincerity. Even Inspector Lake, gruff though he was, allowed himself the satisfaction of a case concluded. But Miss Marple, walking home beneath the dusk, felt the faintest unease. It was not Garrett's guilt that troubled her. His own words had bound him tighter than any rope. It was the sense of a pattern unfinished, of a seam left ragged. She could not name it yet, but she knew the cloth of truth had not been fully hemmed. The twist revealed itself the next morning. A messenger from the county court arrived at the Swan bearing a packet of Lydia Ransom's papers recently recovered from her bureau. Among them was a half-written letter to her sister in Cheltenham. Inspector Lake unfolded it with triumph, certain it would name Garrett as the scoundrel. Instead, it contained a startling line. "If anything should happen to me, it will be the work of Hetty Pike. She resents my promises and fears what I may tell." The words struck like a bell. Lake pounded the table. "By heaven, we've been chasing the wrong fox." The woman suspected her own servant. Perhaps Garrett's confession was nothing but bravado. Perhaps Pike... But Miss Marple raised her hand. "No, Inspector. Lydia wrote those words, yes, but you must see them for what they are. An echo of the same cruelty she showed years ago. She ruined Agnes with a careless accusation. She sought to control Garrett with another. Lydia enjoyed arranging suspicion as other women arrange flowers. Still, the letter could not be ignored. Hetty was summoned, pale as parchment, her hands twisting in her apron. Lake demanded answers. She swore on her soul that she had never harmed her mistress, that she had only wished to serve. Yet her terror made her look guilty, and soon half the village was whispering that Miss Marple had been wrong. That night, Miss Marple sat long by her lamp, piecing the pattern anew. She thought of Lydia's habit of using suspicion as a weapon, of Garrett's humiliation, of Mrs. Lydgate's pride. And suddenly she remembered something small, something everyone else had forgotten. The sugar smear on the second cup. Lydia had never taken sugar. Hetty, poor woman, could not afford it. Garrett, perhaps. But no, it was Mrs. Hart, who had a sweet tooth, who dropped 2 lumps into her tea with unfailing regularity. And Mrs. Hart had been everywhere in this affair. It was she who sold the threads and needles, she who recalled Garrett's purchase years before, she who noticed bottle green and told all who would listen. She who insisted she never pried while prying into every detail. She who alone had the keys to gossip, and to the shop where thread, chalk and trifles could vanish without trace. The realization clicked shut like the clasp of the sewing box. Miss Marple called for Inspector Lake at once. "It is not Garrett alone, Inspector. He was guilty, yes, but he was not clever enough to stage the entire play. Someone else embroidered the pattern, tightening each stitch." Lake stared at her. "You don't mean—" "I mean Mrs. Hart. Consider she supplied the very items used for the trick. She spread each rumor at precisely the moment it was needed. About James's debts, about Garrett's codicils, even about Hetty's supposed resentment. She guided suspicion like a hand-guiding thread, and that smear of sugar on the cup. Lydia would never have left it, nor Garrett, who feared evidence. But Mrs. Hart, she always sweetens her tea." Lake's face darkened. "If you're right, she's still free. And she's bold enough to meddle with evidence even under our noses." The trap was set that same afternoon. Miss Marple invited Mrs. Hart to tea at her cottage, all politeness and warmth. On the tray she laid 2 cups, one with sugar, one without. She set a small bolt and thread nearby, as though forgotten from her knitting bag. And then she began, in her mildest tone, to recount how Garrett had confessed, how the village was satisfied, how Lydia's letter had cast suspicion elsewhere. Mrs. Hart leaned forward eagerly, eyes shining. "Well, I always said Hetty had a streak in her. Never liked her look. And Garrett, of course. Men are weak. But it's the women who hold grudges. I dare say Lydia feared her servant more than any nephew." Miss Marple poured tea, watching closely. Without hesitation, Mrs. Hart reached for the sugar tongs, dropping 2 neat lumps into her cup. And as she stirred, her free hand moved unconsciously to the bolt and thread, fingers twitching as though to demonstrate. It was enough. Lake, waiting, in the next room, stepped forward. "That will do, Mrs. Hart. You've staged your last scene." The woman froze, her spoon clinking against the cup. For a moment she looked as though she might brazen it out, but then her voice broke into shrill anger. "She mocked me too. Lydia Ransom, with her neat airs, treating me as if my shop were a confessional, and I her servant. She thought herself above us all, handing out crumbs of legacies, dictating which colors we might use in our quilts. Well, I showed her. I stitched her end as neatly as any hem." The words spilled like unraveled thread. She railed against Lydia, against Garrett, against the whole village that had relied on her shop yet never respected her. Her bitterness was raw, corrosive, decades in the making. When she was led away, Miss Marple sighed softly. "You see, Inspector—" Garrett struck the blow, but it was Mrs. Hart who threaded the needle. She nudged, she guided, she whispered. Without her, the murder would have been clumsy and soon discovered. With her, it became a tapestry of suspicion. Lake shook his head in disbelief. 2 villains, not one, and all because of pride and resentment. Not pride only, Miss Marple corrected. Loneliness. Mrs. Hart had lived her life behind that counter, seeing everyone's secrets but belonging to no one's circle. Lydia Ransom reminded her of it daily. That loneliness hardened into something darker. And so she stitched herself into the crime until she could not unpick her own work. The roses at Hawthorne Cottage, battered by autumn winds, scattered their petals once more across the gravel. To the village, the case was closed. Garrett guilty, Mrs. Hart complicit. But to Miss Marple, it was the last-minute twist that proved what she had always known. The most dangerous motives are not always greed or passion, but the small, quiet wounds of everyday life, festering until they drive people to the darkest of embroideries. And so the pattern at last was complete. The trial of Mr. Garrett and Mrs. Hart was the talk of St. Mary Mead for weeks. Villagers hurried to the Swan to hear the latest whispers from the county paper. The vicar's wife wrung her hands that such a scandal should have touched their parish at all. James Ransom, freed from suspicion, strutted about the green with the air of a man wronged but vindicated. Hetty Pike prayed for her mistresses, sole in the back pew of the church, though her prayers often dissolved into tears. Inspector Lake, though grim, allowed himself a measure of satisfaction. 2 conspirators unmasked, he said to Miss Marple. The court will settle them. I only wish every case tied itself so neatly. But Miss Marple, seated by her fire with her knitting, gave him one of her gentle smiles. My dear Inspector, neatness is never the business of crime. It is our task to make it so afterward. And you must remember, it was not two conspirators at the start, but one. Mr. Garrett struck the blow. Mrs. Hart embroidered the scene until no one knew where truth ended and lies began. Lake frowned. And yet one wonders, which of them was worse? Garrett with his shame and fury, or Mrs. Hart with her envy and gossip? Worse? Miss Marple shook her head. They were halves of the same cloth. Without Garrett's desperation, there would have been no blow. Without Mrs. Hart's cunning, no one would have doubted. Each carried what the other lacked. That is, why the pattern seemed so tangled. The verdict, when it came, was swift. Garrett was sentenced to hang. Mrs. Hart, her hands trembling as she clutched the dock rail, was condemned to prison for life. St. Mary Mead declared justice satisfied. But Miss Marple noticed how the roses at Hawthorne Cottage, left untended, dropped their petals onto the gravel walk, as though marking not triumph, but sorrow. On the evening after the verdict, a small gathering took place at the vicarage. Lake was there, and James and Hetty and a few others who had hovered on the case's edges. They pressed Miss Marple to explain how she had known when so many had been misled. She folded her hands and spoke with the calm clarity of one setting a pattern straight. First there was the matter of the sewing box. Everyone praised Mrs. Ransom for her orderliness, yet when the dagger was found inside, it lay crooked, diagonal. That alone told me it had been placed by a hand that knew the box but did not belong to it. That hand was Garrett's. He had seen it often enough when Lydia forced him to wait while she threaded a needle or wound her reels, but he did not understand its language. Second, she continued, was the cup with the smear of sugar. Lydia never sweetened her tea. Hetty could scarcely afford the luxury, but Mrs. Hart always took 2 lumps. She could not resist the habit even in her staging. That small smear betrayed her as surely as a signature. Third was the reel. Curved thread. We all noticed the bottle green because it caught the eye, but the true tool was the white, which vanished against the door. When that reel disappeared, I knew someone feared its discovery more than the dagger itself. And when I found it slipped beneath the lining of the work-basket, I knew a clumsy hand had tried to hide it. Garrett had used it, but Mrs. Hart had stolen it later to protect them both. She paused, letting the quiet sink in. The chalk on the mirror, the missing paper knife, the too-ready confession of Mrs. Lydgate. All these were threads in the same fabric. Alone, each was nothing. Together they told the story plain. James shifted uneasily. And my part in it, Miss Marple, the whole village thought me guilty. You were careless, James, she said kindly. And greedy, yes, but not cunning. A man who storms about the green with debts hanging over him does not contrive tricks of thread and bolt. The signs were too subtle for you. That, in the end, saved you. Hetty's eyes brimmed. And poor Mrs. Lydgate. Pride undid her, Miss Marple said softly. She wanted so much to be important that she half believed her own guilt. That is the danger of vanity. But she did not kill. She was merely another piece moved across the board. Lake leaned forward. So, Miss Marple, we may say justice has been served. She hesitated. The fire crackled. At last she spoke, her tone grave. Served, perhaps. Yet do not mistake. Justice for peace. Garrett's shame, Mrs. Hart's envy. Those will echo long after verdicts are read. Agnes the maid, ruined years ago, lies still in her grave, and Lydia Ransom herself sowed much of what she reaped by her cruelty. Justice may balance the scales, Inspector, but it cannot mend the cloth once torn. The room was silent. Each felt the weight of her words. In the weeks that followed, Garrett awaited his fate with stony silence. Mrs. Hart, behind prison walls, raged and wept in turn. St. Mary Mead returned outwardly to its routines. The shop, bell ringing, the church bells chiming, gossip once more about harvests and weather. But underneath lay an unease. For if such darkness could flower among neighbours they had known for years, what else might bloom unseen? One afternoon, as Miss Marple tended her roses, Hetty approached, hesitant. Miss, do you think it's over, truly? Or might there be more we don't see? Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear, there is always more we don't see. But this embroidery at least is finished. The cloth is ugly, yes, but the stitches are complete. And with that she clipped a spent bloom, its petals falling to the earth, and turned back toward her quiet cottage. She knew better than anyone that justice, once served, never feels quite sweet. It is a necessary draught, bitter, cleansing, leaving behind not triumph but silence. In that silence the truth stood unshaken. Pride, shame, envy, cruelty, those had been the true murderers. Garrod and Mrs. Hart were only their instruments, and Miss Marple, who had unpicked each stitch until the pattern lay bare, understood that the case was not an end, but a reminder. The past always lingers in villages, like thread left on a rug, easy to miss, impossible to ignore once seen. So justice had been served, or perhaps only escaped, but the truth at least would not fade. The air in St. Mary Mead grew cooler with autumn. The roses at Hawthorne Cottage, so often noted in whispers, had shed their last petals. Lydia Ransom's. Death was already becoming a tale told over teacups, a greedy agent, a bitter shopkeeper, the quiet spinster who had noticed what no one else had. Villagers, eager for order, folded the story away as one folds last season's quilt, satisfied to leave it in the chest. But Miss Marple did not quite fold it away. She walked through the lanes, polite as ever, nodding to neighbours, yet her mind returned again and again to one thread of unease. The pattern had been revealed, yes. Garrod's guilt and Mrs. Hart's malice were laid bare. Justice, of a sort, had been served, and yet something tugged still, like a knot in her knitting, refusing to come smooth. It was Hetty Pike who stirred it first. The girl stopped her outside the church one morning, apron flapping in the breeze. "Miss, I can't sleep still," she confessed. "When I close my eyes I see her chair, just so, with her head tipped back, and there's something I can't forget." The day before she died, Mrs. Ransom asked me to fetch her old prayer book from the box in her bedroom. I did, but there was a letter tucked inside, and she snapped it shut before I could see. She told me, "No one must know yet." Do you think it mattered? Miss Marple soothed her, but inwardly she pricked up her ears. A hidden letter, not among the bureau papers Inspector Lake had sorted, not in the bundle from Cheltenham. A letter unseen. To whom had it been addressed? And why had Lydia been so sharp about it, when she was ordinarily proud to display her correspondence? That evening, Miss Marple sat by her lamp and turned over all the pieces once more. She thought of Garrod's bitterness, Mrs. Hart's envy, Lydia's cruelty, Agnes's ruin. All were explained, however darkly, but the missing letter gnawed at her. Was it simply destroyed in the chaos, or had someone taken it? A week later, the answer tiptoed into sight. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Lydgate, restored, now to her place after her humiliating false confession, came bustling into the shop where Miss Marple stood. She chattered as usual, words spilling like buttons from a drawer. "And I do thank heaven that dreadful business is over. But do you know, dear Miss Marple, I found something curious. Among my hymnals, one I lent to Lydia months ago, there was a slip of paper folded flat. I thought at first it was a bookmark, but when I smoothed it, well, it looked like a fragment of a letter. Odd hand, too. Foreign, I should say. I burned it, of course, not wishing to meddle, but it gave me quite a turn. Miss Marple's needles paused in her bag. Burned. A foreign hand. A fragment found where it did not belong." She smiled, thanked the vicar's wife, and said nothing. But inside the knot tightened. That night she walked once more past Hawthorne Cottage. The windows were shuttered now, the gate leaning, the roses bare. Yet in the stillness she felt the echo of Lydia's presence, tidy, watchful, controlling. Had Lydia, in her last days, corresponded with someone outside the village, someone whose words might have explained not only Garrod's desperation, but Lydia's sudden urgency to alter her will? She remembered the phrase James had muttered in The Swan, half drunk, half bitter. She always said she had friends in places we wouldn't understand. No one had taken it seriously, but perhaps they should have. Miss Marple did not voice her thoughts. To Inspector Lake she spoke only of gardening, of weather, of small things. He was satisfied. The law had done its work. But she carried the unease home with her, placing it alongside all the other puzzles she had lived through. The truth of Garrod and Mrs. Hart was enough for the village, yet Miss Marple, who knew that mysteries rarely end as cleanly as they seem, understood that Lydia's life and her death might have held deeper shadows still. For weeks afterward, she would find herself glancing at her knitting bag where the sermon leaflet bearing her notes lay folded. Thread, codicil, legacy, Agnes. Knife, blue ink. She added a final word in her neat hand. Letter. Because in St. Mary Mead, secrets are never buried far. And somewhere, beyond the roses and the gossip, beyond Garrod's shame and Mrs. Hart's envy, a letter had been written, its words lost, but its weight lingering. Miss Marple, with her gentle eyes and her quiet persistence, knew she would stumble upon its meaning one day. Mysteries, after all, never end. They simply wait, like threads left uncut for a steady hand to draw them out. And so as she closed her curtains against the autumn night, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. The village might be content with justice. She, however, remained, content only with truth, and truth she knew still had another story to tell.